Hello everyone, welcome to this spotlight session, first one for a little while, first one of 2022. Today we're going to be looking at a few of the books from the collections that are related to myths and legends of various types. And we have obviously quite a lot of books in our collections that have some element of myth in them, and I've got just 4 examples out today to show you. So the first one I want to show you is this rather beautiful book. So this is Classical Myth and Legend with illustrations in colour and monochrome from famous paintings and statuary by A.R. Hope Moncrieff. So you can see that the cover is rather beautiful. It's a book cloth cover, but it's been embossed and gilt and has the black ink on it as well. And the design continues across the spine too, in this rather nice kind of Art Nouveau style. And within the book as well, the style continues. So for instance, the frontispiece, and the title page is rather beautifully done as well, with this illustration of Pan. And you can see that there are plates within it, colour plates and black and white plates too. Lots of sort of contemporary paintings from the time when the book was published, which was around about 1912. So we've got a lot of pre-Raphaelite paintings. We also have images of classical statuary too. Where was the one I just found? Within the Fall of Troy. So yes, so there are also images of statuary as well. So we have contemporary illustrations of the Greek myths, Greek and Roman myths. We also have older pieces of art, and one of the things that's very nice is that in the labels for each of the pieces of art, it tells you where they are, so the provenance of the painting or the statuary is also included in it. And then within the book itself, there's an introductory section which looks at the nature of myth, and then retellings of the classical myths. So it's the Greek and Roman pantheon, it's the stories of myth from Greece and Rome. And this book, as it says on the title, was published by A.R. Hope Moncrieff. And A.R. Hope Moncrieff was a pseudonym of Robert Hope Moncrieff, who was born in 1846 in Scotland and lived to be 81. He died in 1927. He was a prolific writer from a very young age, and he is especially renowned for children's fiction, but he also wrote a number of works for adults, including some of the Black's Guides. And Black's Guides were accessible travel guides which were published by Adam and Charles Black in Edinburgh, and Hope Moncrieff wrote some of those. He also wrote short stories, novels, translations, encyclopedia entries, reference works as well, and as I say, not just for children. So he used the pseudonym A.R. Hope Moncrieff on some adult works. He also sometimes adopted the pseudonym A. Scott, and this pseudonym potentially was just a little bit of a joke about the fact that he was Scottish, and so often published works as A. Scott. But his writing is quite energetic, it's quite fun to read, so this is rather nice. So within the collection, as well as this book on classical myth and legend, we also have a book about authors which he wrote, which includes an autobiographical section about himself as one of the authors that he's talking about. And we have 2 of the Black's Guides. We have the Black's Guide to Derbyshire and the Black's Guide to the Peak Country, both of which are rather lovely books too. They're very beautifully illustrated with nice covers in a similar style to the style on this one. One of the other interesting things about this book that you'll notice is that it is actually, its class mark is CC, so CC 1658. CC is the section of history and antiquities, which is a slightly interesting place for us to have classified this particular work. Obviously it's myth and legend, which one may say shouldn't necessarily go into a history section, but I suspect the fact that it's classical myth and legend, Greek and Roman, is the reason why we put it into the antiquities section. So this is a rather lovely book, and a good one to start this spotlight session with. The next books which I'd like to talk about are actually 4 books, but I'm talking about them all as one because they're effectively a set. So these are The Traditions of Lancashire by John Roby. We have the 2 volumes of the first series and then also the 2 volumes of the second series. These are collections of folk tales which have been written and illustrated in these volumes. So both series have plates that were drawn by G. Pickering and engraved by Edward Findon, plates before many of the tales and some illustrations within the tales as well. And you can see that we've stamped each of the plates with the NSL logo, which is something that we used to do when at a time when there was a possibility that people might come into libraries and archives and cut plates out of books and try to sell them as separate individual illustrations, because there was quite a market for that, and to a certain extent there still is. So one of the ways that we tried to avoid that was by putting the NSL stamp on each of the plates. So within some of our older books you will often see this curly NSL logo, yes, NSL logo on the individual plates within a book. So, John Roby, who wrote these books, was born in Wigan in 1793, and he worked as a banker in Lancashire. And obviously, whilst he was there, he was collecting traditional tales and stories of the local area. So he published these first 2 volumes of folk tales in 1829, and they were hugely popular. So he went on then to publish the second series 2 years later. Now, Wikipedia, that source of all knowledge, notes that some people couldn't believe that these books had been written by a banker, so they queried their authorship because it had to be someone who was more creative than someone who worked in a bank, which amused me when I found that on the internet. But Roby is sometimes cited as an early folklorist, as a collector of oral tales, but the tales as they're written in these books seem to be more like embellished narratives based on folk tales rather than actually being accurate transcriptions of folk tales. And certainly we've classified these in the DC section, which is our fiction section, rather than, for instance, as poetry or history. So we have the 4 volumes here. I shall just show you some of the illustrations. So a lot of the illustrations are of the places that are mentioned within the tales. So rather than necessarily illustrating the action that happens in the tales, we've got illustrations of natural scenes and buildings and so on. And the frontispiece for each of them is this Traditions of Lancashire engraving, which has fantastically 3 little witches on a crag just here, and obviously the eagle flying above and the ruined Gothic archway that's seen through. You can tell why I love these books. These are fantastic. And the tales are quite easy to read, and they're quite interesting and quite fun, although obviously written in the kind of early 19th century style, so a little bit stylised. But these books are available to borrow, and they are quite a nice addition to the fiction section of our collection. The third books which I want to talk about in this spotlight session on myths and legends are in our poetry section. So this is the DB section of the collection. And this is a 2-volume set. You can see how beautiful it looks. This was rebound in 2003 by Cyril Formby of Ramsbottom, and he managed to keep the original boards from the book and gave them a new spine, and he's noted on our records that the spine was blind tooled and gilded in 18th century style, because this is an 18th century book. You can see from the volume that I've got open that there's also gilded tooling around the inside edges of the covers too. It is a rather beautiful set of books. So this is the, and obviously the reason I've got these ones out is because I couldn't possibly do a spotlight session on myths and legends without talking about Robin Hood. So these are Robin Hood, a collection of all the ancient poems, songs and ballads now extant relative to that celebrated English outlaw, to which are prefixed historical anecdotes of his life. Edited by J. Ritson with wood engravings by Thomas Bewick, and this is from 1795. Now, Joseph Ritson was an interesting chap. Joseph Ritson was born in 1752, lived until 1803. He was an antiquary from Stockton-on-Tees, but he trained for the law, which took him to London in the late 18th century when he was in his 20s. When he was in his 30s, he started publishing, mostly literary criticism, and mostly quite obnoxious and cantankerous literary criticism, pointing out the mistakes in his peers' collections and translations, as well as then collecting and editing songs and romances and so on to publish himself. So he seems to have been quite a cantankerous chap, difficult to get on with, had a temper, and very scathing when he felt that what some of his contemporaries had said things which were wrong, things that he didn't agree with. He also apparently devised his own reformed English spelling and was an early advocate for vegetarianism for both moral and health reasons. So quite an interesting chap. But he's most renowned for this collection of Robin Hood ballads. So basically he went around trying to find examples of songs and ballads and poems that talked about Robin Hood and gathered them together into this one collection. And he is an important person in the history of the development of the myth of Robin Hood. It's noted that he was one of the earliest sources of the altruistic nature of Robin Hood's activities. So he was one of the first people to indicate that Robin Hood stole from the rich to give to the poor, whereas all the previous publications and stories about it seemed to just indicate that he was a thief who stole from the rich just in order to get their money. So the modern image of Robin Hood was largely invented by Ritson, together with published works by other authors such as Sir Walter Scott and Thomas Love Peacock. They put together the kind of notion of Robin Hood as a noble outlaw, a freedom fighter, rather than just as a bit of a criminal. So in this book, Ritson collects together any Robin Hood texts that he could find, ancient ones as well as ones contemporary to himself in the 18th century, and this includes the first publication of what is the earliest known account of Robin Hood, which is A Little Guest of Robin Hood, from around about 1450. What's also interesting is that in the first volume, he starts with The Life of Robin Hood, in which he gives narratives of so-called facts about Robin Hood's life and facts of his character. So interestingly, he's pulled together all these sources, all these stories and traditions, and from them has extracted what he thinks are the facts of Robin Hood as a real historical personage, rather than necessarily just as a legend, as a myth. However, it is notable that the facts that he gives to Robin Hood's character are quite in keeping with the known facts of his own character in terms of his sort of political beliefs and so on. He ascribes to Robin Hood revolutionary tendencies, for example, protection of the poor and the oppressed, and makes Robin Hood less of an outlaw and more of a freedom fighter. So there was certainly an element of politics in the way that Ritson presented Robin Hood. Now, Thomas Bewick, who did the wood engraving, was also an author in his own right. He mostly did natural history works and was especially noted for a history of British birds that he published between 1797 and 1821. So to just have a quick look at some of the illustrations in the book, there are plates which give larger illustrations, which I can't find an example of at the moment. But there are also these little illustrations within the text. So, for instance, a very classical image of Robin Hood with his bow and arrow and the deer behind him running through the forest. So it really is a rather lovely collection, both in terms of the physicality of it as actual beautiful books, and also in terms of the information and the illustrations that are gathered within it. So Robin Hood obviously had to be included in this spotlight session, so these are our nicest examples of the tales of Robin Hood. So for the last book that I want to talk about in this spotlight session, I've moved on to a work that talks about some of the local legends, Nottingham Legends. And the legends in this aren't actually included in the main text of the book, they're part of the appendices for the book. So the book that I've got out here, this copy is from the James Ward Special Collection, but we do have 3 other copies of it in the collection too. This is Walks Round Nottingham by A Wanderer from 1835. And A Wanderer, as has been noted in pen on the title page here, is Matthew Henry Barker. So Matthew Henry Barker was born in 1790, lived till 1846. He was born in Deptford and he served at sea with the East India Company and then with the Navy. I've seen references to him online that referred to him as Captain Barker, although I don't know whether that was actually his rank. In 1825, he moved into journalism and he started by editing a paper in the West Indies and then moved to Nottingham. And in between 1827 and 1838, he was editor of the Nottingham Mercury. So from having been a sailor, he then became a journalist. In later life, he published books of collected tales, mostly nautical tales, which he published under the name The Old Sailor. And when he came to publish this book here, he again didn't use his actual name in the publication. He just used the pseudonym A Wanderer. So Walks Round Nottingham sprang from a series of columns that he wrote in the Nottingham Mercury, and it's 6 walks to various parts of Nottingham, mostly the east, the south and the west of Nottingham, many of which at the time in the 1830s were then just villages that were entirely separated from the city itself. So there's a lot of information about him walking out of Nottingham through the countryside to the various different villages. And he had clearly a great interest in local history and in local legends, which is why I've got this book out for today's Spotlight session. So at the back of the book in the appendices, there are 2 local legends described. I should probably say, whilst I'm flicking through the book, that there are plates including illustrations of the places that he goes on his walks. And I did find online somebody who about 5 or 6 years ago followed one of his walks out through West Bridgeford to Ruddington to see how it had changed from when he wrote it. It's changed quite a lot, needless to say. But the appendices include 2 local legends. Firstly, the Fair Maid of Clifton, and secondly, St Anne's Well. And then after those, there is a third appendix, which includes information about the riots and the burning of the castle. So that was in 1831, I believe. So the riots at Nottingham on the rejection of the Reform Bill. So that was, as I said, I think it was 1831, and this book was published 1835. So that really is very close to the time of publication. It's an almost contemporary account of what was happening then. And it's interesting that it's gone in the appendices with the 2 local legends, is then this account of a local historical event. So the tale of the Fair Maid of Clifton. Henry Kirke White included a version of this in his 1803 collection, Clifton Grove, a sketch in verse and other poems. In the 17th century, there was a play by William Sampson, The Vow-Breaker or The Fair Maid of Clifton. So that's the sort of 1620s, 1630s. So it was a well-established myth and was known more widely than just locally. It tells the tale of the Fair Maid of the title, who is in various different versions has different names. Most commonly she's called Margaret, and her beau, Bateman, she was promised to him, he was called away. They pledged their love before he went, but was almost as soon as he had gone in service, her father insisted that she should marry a local rich man, and then Bateman returns and in despair kills himself at her inconstancy, and she goes mad and disappears or kills herself in various fashions. It's a very cheerful tale, The Fair Maid of Clifton. And this is followed by the tale of St Anne's Well. So St Anne's Well was technically I guess it still is, although it is no longer accessible, was a spring flowing into an underground chamber which was reputed to have healing powers, and people used to come and sit in the water or possibly drink it. In 1409, a chapel to St Anne was built next to the well, so the well had been a special place for a long time before that. in 1409 the chapel was built dedicated to St Anne, and therefore the well became dedicated to St Anne. But even from the 15th century it was also called Robin Hood's Well, so we're back to Robin Hood again. And at some points there have been notes that there was an iron helmet, a chair, a cap and a horn which were reputed to have been used by Robin Hood. So Robin Hood's wicker chair, Robin Hood's iron helmet and Robin Hood's horn. There was a structure built over the top of it, a Victorian Gothic structure, and it seems to have been destroyed by the building of the railways in the 1880s. But in true James Ward style, where we have the tale of St Anne's Well, James Ward has added an illustration to go with it. So the books in the James Ward collection are often notable because James Ward added things into them. He pasted in letters and newspaper cuttings and things into the books. So after the tale of St Anne's Well, James Ward has put in a cyanotype picture of the Gothic Victorian structure that was built over the entrance to St Anne's Well that was then destroyed in the 1880s. So the tale itself is, as I've written in my notes here, it's utter bobbins, but it is romantic bobbins. So it's a legend of a knight arriving at the well who turns out to be the returning King Richard, of course, in disguise, Richard the Lionheart. And he meets a so-called maniac woman at the well, who he eventually recognises as a nobleman that he knew well before he went on crusade, called Matilda, and she's been driven into exile in the woods by his evil brother Prince John. There's a lot of the usual kind of bickering between noblemen, and at one point in the story King Richard, in disguise, meets a forester who stops him and demands money from him. It's a kind of thinly veiled allusion to Robin Hood. But Richard, being the king, defeats Robin Hood quite easily in battle and goes on his way. And there's a tournament happening at Nottingham at which Prince John is presiding. And Richard turns up over various days, Richard and his retinue challenge the evil knights who have done the terrible things to Matilda and driven her into exile. And eventually, at the end of the tournament, Richard goes back to St Anne's Well and finds Matilda dead, embracing the crucifix. So obviously a good bit of redemption in the story there. So as I say, it's a completely rubbish story, but it is interesting that it's been published in this context in an early 19th century book of information about walks around Nottingham, which then records also some of the local legends too. So it's quite an interesting addition to the book, and particularly in James Ward's version that's got the picture of the previous structure over St Anne's Well that was destroyed by the building of the railways.